Good morning. Man, it's so good to see you at Life Fellowship this July morning. We have a lot of things going on. We got Camp in the City this week. Amen. Give a hand to them. Pastor Dan is with the kids, and so who knows how that's going right now. But we're each taking turns. Listen, I think it's so great that Pastor Dan and I get an opportunity to go over there, and I want the kids of this church to see Dan and I as their pastor too, and that's one of the reasons why we're doing that. And so one of the things that we're doing, as you know, in the series this summer is Voices from the Congregation. And that is not just so that Dan and I can preach at Kid Life. That is actually a strategic initiative of ours, because one of the things that's important for us is that we believe that the job of the leadership of this church is to equip people for the work of the ministry. What that means is the people that are paid on staff, it's not our job to do everything. What we want to do is we want to make sure that every single one in this church, that means that we're helping you take that next step of what it means to follow Christ. And every single person that's going to be speaking this month, and we've had a great job with Andy and Jose and this morning with Josh, are taking that next step of leadership in whatever God's calling them to do. So it is so thrilling that we get a chance to do this, because I believe that the opportunities that God is going to open up for us in this church are going to be greater. And we've just got to be ready to be obedient and take that next step. And so Josh Brahm is speaking this morning. I love Josh. Josh is a friend of mine. He and I have gotten a chance to know each other over the last year plus since I've been here. And here's what I love about Josh. Josh is a listener, and he is a learner. And I believe that for every single one of us, if we want God to change us, if we want God to truly transform us, we have to listen and learn from him. And I think the stories he's going to share and who he's been shaped by, not only through his experiences, but through the Spirit of God, you are going to benefit greatly and rejoice greatly in what God is doing. And so we have a lot to learn from how God has shaped him. Would you welcome Josh Brahm with me this morning?
Good morning. Thank you, Ben. Oh, this is going to be a good day. I am so excited to tell you about this thing that I've been thinking a lot about for the last 7 years or so. Turn in your Bibles or your apps to Colossians 4. And while you do that, I'll tell you a little bit about how I have been thinking about this a long time. I remember having a conversation with a woman at the airport 7 years ago. I was in the Denver airport. This was like my last layover on my way home. I had like 45 minutes, just enough time to grab a sandwich and eat at my gate and then get on my last flight home. And I sat across from a businesswoman in her late 30s, and she asked me the question that I have spent my entire career hating. What do you do for a living? It was like, as a pro-life speaker guy, assuming she's pro-choice, how do I answer this question in a way that's not going to get us started off on the wrong foot? And so I tried all these different ways of answering the question, none of which I was happy with. And so that day I answered a question in a new way, and this has become my go-to response. Anytime I'm on a plane or something and someone asks me, this is pretty much what I tell them. So she said, "What do you do for a living?" I said, "I try to help pro-lifers to be less weird." And she smiled a little bit. So it was already working better than anything I'd said before. And so she said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to help pro-life people to make more good arguments and fewer bad ones. But more importantly, I want to help us to connect relationally with people who are different from us. I want to help us to connect with people who are coming from a different religious background, a different political background. I want us to live out Colossians 4, 5 through 6. So let's read. This is my favorite passage. It says, "Walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person." Let me tell you a couple things I love about this verse. One thing is this idea of seasoning with salt. Food without salt on it can be really boring. I wasn't there, but I've heard the story, the legend, that a mega church in Atlanta once custom ordered a bunch of Chick-fil-A fries for their Sunday morning service, because they're going to talk about this, and they ordered them with no salt on them. And I wasn't there, but I've heard it was awful. I've heard it was like disgusting to eat these fries without salt. And so this tells me that God wants our conversations to be interesting, for there to be variety. That they shouldn't be bland. They shouldn't be boring. There can even be an art to it. Cooking can be an art. It's not an art that I have. Like, I can make chocolate chip cookies pretty consistently. I can make bacon. That's about the limit. But I was watching recently the chef show on Netflix. Anyone seen this with Jon Favreau and then this like master chef mentor guy that goes around with him and they're making food? And I'm watching this. I'm like, they're putting 25 or 30 ingredients into this thing and they're working on it for days. I'm like, that's art. Our conversations with people, with outsiders, can be art. There's more of an art than a science to this sometimes. And then I love this idea at the end where it talks about you'll know how you should respond to each person. That tells us, like, directly that we aren't supposed to say the same thing to every person. Evangelism done well is more than just memorizing the 4 spiritual laws in John 3:16 and some Christianese slogans that you can just say to someone if they're willing to listen to you. It's more complicated than that. It's the thing that we talk about at Equal Rights Institute a lot, is that like there's not a flowchart mentality to our dialogues. If they say this, then you say this. And they say that, then you say that. No. Like, can we stop treating people like formulas for a second and remember that they're people and that people have different needs? So we tell people, like when I'm having these conversations with like a pro-choice person, my goal there is not exactly to make them pro-life or even to get them on their knees in humility before the cross. My goal is to love them. And that's complicated. Loving people is complicated because people are complicated. So sometimes I'm having a conversation with someone and I feel like what this person needs, or maybe the Holy Spirit is telling me what this person needs, is a good pro-life argument. Cool, I'm ready for that. But then I've had other conversations where I feel like, no, what this person really needs is to understand why I believe in the Bible. Why do I believe in this 2,000-year-old book? And I can be like, oh, well, I'll tell you, I think there's this guy 2,000 years ago who walked out of his own tomb. And if that's true, and I think it is, I think that's a historical fact. If that's true, then that guy gets benefit of the doubt points on everything else he said. And he said he was the Son of God. Like, I can kind of go that direction. And then there's other people where what they needed most was just to be heard by me. And I could tell you stories about that, but I don't have time. But like, there's some times where that's not the most important thing for me to do, is to make an argument. It's just to hear them, because they've never had a Christian pro-life person care about them enough to just listen to what they have to say. About 7 years ago, I began thinking about connecting with people in a more relational way, because I got invited into this Facebook group, this secret Facebook group thing. I know that sounds all clandestine. It's just like how Facebook, you can't search for it, it's like what they call it. It's like this abortion debate group. And so there's like a few pro-lifers, including me, and then like about a dozen pro-choice people. We spent about a year debating abortion in this group. And I did it because I saw it as like this potential interesting social experiment. Because up until that point, I had never spent more than a couple of hours with a pro-choice person. Like typically we'll go to a college campus and we'll do an outreach and we'll talk to people. And I have long conversations with people. I love that. I love the quality over quantity thing. But at the same time, I don't typically see them again, right? And so here I was like, ooh, I can talk to the same people for like hundreds of hours, basically. I still remember those people, Jessica and Ronnie and Kara and Kira. Like, we really got to know each other in that group. And in that process, yeah, I did learn some things that I was hoping to learn. I was kind of testing different kinds of pro-life arguments with them, and I did learn some things. But I ended up getting changed in a way that was not what I expected. I think for the first time, as a result of that group, I began to humanize pro-choice people. I'm good at humanizing the unborn. I was not good at humanizing the pro-choice, flesh and blood image bearer that was in front of me. And I started seeing pro-choice people as people. They're multifaceted, interesting creatures with desires and beliefs and cultural backgrounds and all these things that are affecting them. And that started changing the way that I thought about dialogue in general. And it's like, what if we were friends with these people? I started thinking about that. And then the group imploded after about a year. We let it get too big, and a couple of bad people got in there, and we just didn't have the time to deal with it, and it just kind of fell apart. And right around that time, God brought someone else into my life. And I'll share this story with you in a second, but let me give you a sense of what I want to talk about this morning. I'm using this phrase, relational apologetics. And I'm not the only speaker who uses this phrase, but it kind of came naturally because I've taken this idea that's been out there, relational evangelism, and I'm just using it more broadly. Yes, we should have religious conversations and theological conversations in the context of friendship, but we can also have conversations about moral or political issues in this context too. And so when I say relational apologetics, I mean cultivating relationships with people who have different beliefs for the sake of genuine friendship and for discovering truth together. Said another way, I want to encourage more dialogue among friends and less debate among strangers. So what I want to do this morning is share with you some stories that I hope will paint a beautiful picture of what this can look like. And I'm going to share with you a couple of arguments for why I think the church ought to do this, and I'm going to give you some practical tips, because this is hard. It is easy to be friends with people who are exactly like you. It is hard to be friends with people who think really differently than you. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about, like, what is working? What is not working? I want to try to help you that way. And then at the end, we're going to close in prayer, and we're going to pray that God put someone on our hearts that he's calling us to do this with. So let me tell you about Deanna. They're going to put a picture of her up on the screen. As around the time the Facebook group closed, Deanna sends me an email with like a pro-choice essay. It's like, here's why she's pro-choice. She's a pro-choice blogger. And she's seen me on YouTube and kind of liked it, and so she sent me this message, and here's why I'm pro-choice. And I could tell in that email this year is intelligent and open-minded. And that is a really unusual combination. You want to jump and grab onto those people. That's awesome. Because everyone says they're open-minded, and I think pretty few are. But she was. And I don't have time to define what I mean by open-mindedness. There's a YouTube video of me talking about open-mindedness if you want to know what I mean by that. But she was that thing, that awesome thing. And I emailed her back, and I said, I'd love to talk to you. And I responded to a couple of the things that she said. And 127 emails later, we were friends. I counted. That's real. I went and I reread them. I kept everything. One day there's going to be a book on this, but I haven't spent enough time doing it. But you know, she identified as a pro-choice atheist lesbian in Canada. So you wouldn't expect that we would have very much in common, being that she's from Canada. That was good. But we did have enough in common. We were interested in the subject. We were open-minded. We were interested in believing true things and not just comfortable things. We're really into philosophy and interested in the subject. That's enough. That's enough to build a friendship on. And after 127 emails, we began to Skype. For 1 or 2 hours at a time, we would Skype. And an interesting thing happened at this point in our friendship is, like, we were never only talking about abortion. I was being pretty intentional at that point, even of trying to make my emails kind of personable, kind of take some of the things I learned in that Facebook group. But once we started to Skype, like the ratio of the time talking about abortion versus just the typical things friends talk about changed to about 50-50. So she's asking me about how my wife and kids are doing. I'm talking to her about when she moved out of her parents' house for the first time. She figuratively walked with me through the terrifying journey of starting a nonprofit 5 years ago and support raising for the first time. I was there to grieve with her when her grandfather died, her first near-family death after having become an atheist. We talked about same-sex marriage a lot, as you can imagine. And after a year and a half of friendship, she would eventually become pro-life. And something really interesting happened, is she spent this 3-week period wrestling with herself, because she knew that her pro-choice arguments had all been beaten soundly. And she was, to her credit, too intellectually virtuous and honest to not ignore that. She couldn't. But she was terrified of identifying herself as pro-life, because basically all of her other friends are not just pro-choice, they're gay rights activists. Like, her Facebook timeline's a really colorful place. You follow? Like, that's her culture. So it's like, what if she identifies as pro-life? Like, what will happen? And after 3 weeks, she got over it. She got a blank white shirt. We're going to put a picture on the screen. She wrote out a pro-life argument on it, which says, I think it's human because its parents are human. It's alive because it's growing. And all humans should have an equal right to life, so it should have a right to life. What do you think? She took that shirt. She went to the Canadian March for Life, the National March for Life. She came back home, took this picture, and posted it on Facebook. And that is the moment that she came out of the closet for the second time in her life. This time as a pro-life person. Now, I asked her, how did you get over the fear thing? As we were talking about her for lack of a better word, conversion. How did you get over the fear? As someone who struggles with fear a lot, how did you get over the fear? So he said, eventually I figured something out. So he said, I figured out that even if the worst case scenario happened, if all of my other friends abandoned me, there'd still be one guy on the other side of the fence welcoming me with open arms. And that was enough. That was enough for her to begin identifying as pro-life. And then we published a story, and we started, and we actually got to speak together. We went to the University of Portland, and I got to meet her finally for the first time. There's some pictures of that are going to be on the screen, and we got to share the story and share some practical tips for how to do this. We're still really good friends to this day. Let me tell you another story. Let me tell you about Ronnie. I don't have any pictures of Ronnie, but Ronnie was one of the pro-choice people in that Facebook debate group. She was one of the most extremely pro-choice people in there. She was like mocking pro-lifers towards the beginning of this time. But she liked me, and I liked her. And so I remember early on, or at least at some point, thinking, if anyone's going to change their mind, I think she might be the most likely one. And so we'd really connected. Ronnie's an amazing reader. She's a good thinker. Her fantasy is to be a Supreme Court justice. That gives you kind of a sense of who Ronnie is. And Ronnie, after 5 or 6 years of friendship, would ultimately also become pro-life. And she ended up writing a series of articles about her journey. So I get to actually share with you a little bit from her own words what her experience was like. I want to read you this paragraph. This is something she described what it was like after being in the Facebook group for a while. She wrote this, and it's like there's so many things that we can learn from this. It's so interesting. She said, I had started to call myself on the fence because I came to realize, slowly but surely, that there were many great pro-life points out there and great pro-life people, even if I didn't realize that my quote-unquote enemies were some of them. There were bad pro-choice arguments also, and I'm really glad that the ones who first started pointing these out to me were not the stereotypical, hateful pro-lifers or extremists. She says, I don't know what I would have done if they had been. No doubt I would have been even more resistant to change than I already was. Isn't that interesting? So later, before she becomes pro-life, I would end up spending some time with her in Wichita, Kansas, because I was going to go out and spend some time with my friend and colleague Steve Wagner from Justice for All, and my friend Clinton, who's an apologist. And she lived near there. So I invited, can you come down? Can we spend some time together? So she came down. And we hung out in Steve's kitchen/dining room, for an hour or two. And this is what she wrote about that time. Later, she says, we all sat in the kitchen dining room area, and the real talking began. It was wonderful to be able to be heard. In most online debates, you speak all you want, but your arguments are seldom heard from the opposite side. And if they are, it is mostly so that the opposing side can misconstrue them. Anyone here had that experience? Yeah. For a long time, by that day, I had been mostly asking questions and lurking. Of course, I debate too, but it was mostly on the pages where, again, you weren't really heard. But here these people were, all pro-life, mind you, talking to me, asking me questions, and here's the kicker, actually listening to me. They didn't tell me I was wrong. They didn't call me a murderer. They addressed what I said, asked for clarification, and they let me ask questions, answering every single one that I asked. Now this was a discussion. Their questions were sometimes difficult to answer, though. So afterwards, Clinton and I took her to Olive Garden, her favorite restaurant that she doesn't get to go to very often. We spent pretty much the whole time talking about abortion, as you do. And it was a really good conversation. And we really connected, and it was sometime later that she would end up becoming pro-life. And in an article that she wrote for Secular Pro-Life, I think this demonstrates just how pro-life she became. This is what she wrote. As a woman, I neither need nor want the right to kill humans to be equal as a human being. I am a woman. I am strong. I am capable. I am not inferior, and I do not need the right to kill to be equal. Oh, isn't that cool? I've got more stories. But this is not related to me. Other people are finding this too. So let me tell you about Megan Phelps Roper. There's going to be a picture of her on the screen. Megan Phelps Roper. She grew up in Westboro Baptist Church. She's one of Fred Phelps' granddaughters. It's that awful church that goes down and does protests at military funerals and stuff with really terrible signs. This is where she grew up. Now, Megan's siblings, a lot of her older siblings became lawyers. That's how Westboro Baptist Church does their court cases, is they have like these basically free speech lawyers within the family. That's not what Megan did, though. Megan became their Twitter person, their social media person. They have Twitter. Westboro Baptist Church has Twitter. Can you believe that? I don't even want to be on Twitter. And I'm nice. Like, I can't even imagine what it's like to be Westboro Baptist Church on Twitter. But that's what she does. She goes on there. She posts, here's where we're going to be doing our protests and snarky memes and things like that. And naturally, 99% of what she gets back is hate and disgust. But a couple of people did more. They started responding to her. They started asking her questions. Now, she was ready with their talking points to the frequently asked questions. How is it loving to do that? No, she was already ready for that. But then a couple of people on Twitter started asking her questions about how the Bible can square with their activities. Because they take the Bible very seriously. Like, they interpret it wildly differently than I do, right? But they feel like they're taking the Bible. They actually call themselves the only true church. They're the only church in their minds that really takes the Bible seriously. So that's what she needed. So people started asking her questions like, so the Bible says, love your enemies. And pray for your enemies. How do you square that with saying that you want soldiers to die in the war? And she's like, oh. So she go to her mom. She's like, Mom, this person on Twitter said, said this thing. And her mom, she said, gave her answers were so lame and dismissive that it planted this huge seed of doubt in Megan's mind. And then they would post, they do press releases. They're not hiding. They're like, we're going to do a protest at this intersection in front of this funeral. So some of the people on Twitter started following that, and they'd figure out times when they could go out and meet her. They would come to the protest. They'd bring her gifts and flowers. Hey, Megan, it's me from Twitter. And talk to her. She ultimately changed her beliefs. She left the church, which means basically leaving her whole family. She continued to talk to the people on Twitter. She eventually married one of them. And she gave a TED Talk, which I encourage you to watch. There's a picture from the TED Talk that might end up on the screen. And it's awesome. You can really get a sense of what happened for her. Let me tell you one more story, though. This is my favorite one. Let me tell you about my hero. His name is Daryl Davis. Daryl Davis is an amazing black blues pianist. There's going to be a picture of him on the screen. Daryl Davis, I'm good. But I will never be able to do what Daryl Davis can do in front of a piano. He's played with Chuck Berry and other huge, the Johnny B. Good guy. He's amazing. It's art what he does in front of a piano. But that's not why Daryl Davis is famous. Some of you have already heard of him. You just might not know his name. Daryl Davis is famous for befriending members of the KKK and getting them out of the KKK. Yeah. So here's the story. Oh, it gets better. You think that's cool, wait till you hear this. Wait, there's more. So he said he always grew up wanting to ask racists this question. It wasn't even about conversion for him or changing their minds. He just was curious. He wanted to ask them, how can you hate me when you don't even know me? And so he's got this strategy. He gets his white female assistant to cold call these guys and invite them to lunch with their boss. You're already ahead of me. It's worked so well because there were these people's backwards worldview. They just can't imagine a white woman working for a black guy. She doesn't say, she just lets them assume it. And so then they show up to this restaurant and there's Daryl. Welcome, have a seat. And half of them leave. And about half of them stay out of politeness or something. And they'll start to talk. And he'll invite them to come and watch his band play at a blues bar. Here's the thing. When you watch a black man play the piano the way Daryl Davis does, it's really hard to remain a racist. So these guys, including county and state leaders of the KKK, start leaving the KKK and giving them their old robe and hood. There's going to be a picture of that on the screen. He's collected over 200. Here's the point. A lot of pro-life people, and Christians in general, I think, can get pretty pessimistic about people changing, in spite of the example of Saul. We can get pretty pessimistic. Look, If state leaders of the KKK can turn around, if someone who grew up in Westboro Baptist Church can change, there is not a single person in this universe that is unconvertible. So, I want to offer you a couple of arguments for why I think we ought to do this. Here's the pragmatic argument. This is kind of the most obvious one. You are going to have a greater impact on the people that you are friends with than the people that you intellectually spar with on Facebook. Right? If you want to have a greater impact, then that's what you're going to want to do. You don't typically have a huge impact in long Facebook debate threads with hundreds of people like angry cats, like that. You don't have a ton of impact there. It's not like nothing good ever happens. I'm not going to say that it's too extreme. But this is not where people typically change their minds. And I did a series of podcasts with Dan on the Life Talks podcast. And so if you want to hear more about my thoughts on this, you'll have to listen to that because I'm going to give you the really short version. The short version is that everyone is virtue signaling on Facebook. No one's being authentic. They're just trying. They're aware of their image. They're branding. Everyone's branding now. And they're trying to control the way that they look, the way that their image presents. And so there's no authenticity going on. And no one's feeling emotionally safe. No one feels emotionally safe in a Facebook debate. But you can't change your mind unless you feel emotionally safe. And so Facebook might be the place that you find your future pro-choice friend. Right? But then you private message them. Or you email them and say, hey, I saw this thing that you sent on Facebook. I thought that was really interesting. Can we do something weird? Can I take you to Starbucks? Can we grab coffee? I've been wanting to spend more time learning about people who just think differently than me. I haven't done enough of that in the past. I'm a little bit in confirmation bias land. And so would you help me with that? I just want to learn more about your views. And if you want, I'd be happy to share with you what I think or answer your questions. Maybe we can go on a journey together and find more truth. I think that's how this is going to look. Most people will not change their mind, are not able to change their mind because they had one conversation with a stranger on a college campus like me. They need more than that. Because what is going on, between a pro-choice person and the pro-life view, there's a whole bunch of hurdles. I think of literally like hurdles on a racetrack. And I think a lot of times our job is to remove those hurdles. What about back alley arguing, abortions with coat hangers? Oh, okay, let's talk about that. Let's take care of that. What about bodily autonomy arguments? Ooh, good question. That's really important. Let's talk about that and try to remove that. And get them to the place where they actually want to become pro-life. That's what happens for a lot of time, for a lot of people. But they have to be in this context of friendship with someone that they trust. Because if they know that you are smart and virtuous, those two things make a very powerful chord. They know that you're smart, so you're not just repeating whatever you've heard pro-life people say, and you're virtuous, you don't hate women. That's not why you're pro-life, like that kind of thing. Then they will take your words so much more seriously than they would take my words if they stumbled upon me on YouTube or something. As my friend Jim Henderson says, when people like each other, the rules change. My friend Abby Johnson agrees. So some of you know about Abby Johnson's story. The movie Unplanned was about her. She was the director at a Planned Parenthood a long time ago in Texas. And then she was participated in a live ultrasound during an abortion, and she very quickly became pro-life. And now we speak at the same events sometimes. This is something that Abby said that I love. She said, I can't even tell you how sad it makes me when I hear pro-lifers call abortion supporters childish names. I am continually grateful for the pro-lifers who continue to respect my dignity when I worked inside the abortion industry. They hated what I did, but they continued to love me. They never called me a death escort, murderer, or a baby killer. They just called me Abby. They got to know me. They cared about me. And now look where I am today. But I need you to understand this other argument for doing this principal argument, which is that it is just good in and of itself to love people. Joseph Pieper defined love this really cool way. He said, love says that it's good that you exist. And insofar as I am able, I will contribute to your happiness, your existence, your flourishing. Love says that it's good that you exist. And insofar as I am able, I will contribute to your happiness, your existence, your flourishing. That's what I mean when I say that I love Deanna. I want her to be happy. I want her to flourish. Now, she and I might disagree about what flourishing looks like for her, right? But that's what we're talking about here. And I had to think about this. I ultimately had to justify the time that I was spending with Deanna, because once I got out of the Facebook group and into this email exchange, I was becoming more busy. I was traveling around more often and things like that. And I just had to think to myself, like, can I really justify the hundreds of hours that I'm spending doing this if C never ends up changing her mind about anything? Will I be able to justify that time? And I wrestled with that for weeks. And ultimately, the conclusion that I would come to is that even if Deanna never changes about anything, it will be good that at least one person was doing his damnedest to be Jesus to her. Super imperfectly. Like, not well. I'm not good at this. I'm just saying, or like, I'm not that loving, but like, I'm trying. It's like, that's the point. It's like that someone's trying to show her how would Jesus treat her in an email exchange or on Skype or whatever. And I'd explained this to Ronnie one time because after Ronnie became pro-life, a mutual friend of ours had reached out to me and said, Ronnie's going through some personal stuff. I won't get into it, but she's going through some stuff, and it would be really encouraging if you could reach out to her at this time. And so I sent her a private message and was like, how are you doing? And she's like bewildered that I was interested because she's already pro-life. And she sees me very differently than how I see me. She sees me as like this pro-life celebrity, which is an oxymoron. There's no such thing. It's like a very small group of us. It's like of known pro-life speakers, like 100 of us or something like that. It's not a celebrity thing. But that's the way that where she's coming from. And so she's just like, why would you care about me at that level? I'm like, because I do care about you. I want to know how you're actually doing. So like, why would you ask that? I said, Ronnie, because I'm following another guy's lead. Because when Jesus nailed my sins to the cross, I was more different from him than Deanna was for me as a pro-choice atheist lesbian from Canada. Right? Think Romans 5:8. But God shows his love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were still sinners. So Christians have a really good reason for doing this, is we're just trying to follow in Jesus' footsteps. If you end up doing this, you're following in his footsteps. You're not following in mine. You're following Jesus' lead, like I'm trying to. Imagine what would happen if all the pro-life Christians in Cornelius did this. Cornelius would change. It would take a long time, and it would be messy, because relationships are messy. But it would be an amazing way to let God work through you. So let me offer you 7 practical tips for doing this well. Tip number 1, avoid long public Facebook debates. I think you should start with email or a private message. Better than that, Skype or FaceTime. Better than that, in person, grabbing coffee or something like that. So if you're looking for the person that God is going to bring into your life, if they're local, that person gets extra points on the board. Because there's just something very unique that happens when you're in person with someone. Tip number 2, don't think of this as a war. Daniel Cohen gave this great TED Talk where he said, if argument equals war, then learning equals losing. If argument equals war, then learning equals losing. If the way that you think about this argument is that, in the end, the end result is that learning equals losing, that's a big problem. And so I think that we ought to go into these conversations as learners. You ought to be open-minded too. You ought to be in a place of learning. I have learned so much from my atheist friends, my pro-choice friends. I've learned more from them about where they're coming from than I've learned from Christians talking about them. So don't think of this as a war. This is a dialogue, not a debate. The idea is, this is not like a debate. It's like there's podiums and stuff. I've done this. Like, that's your opponent. Your goal is to win this audience. This is not like that. This is a dialogue. It's one-on-one. There's no audience. There's no points. You're on a team. You are standing shoulder to shoulder, staring at a problem, trying to find truth together. That's the attitude. It's a wildly different attitude. Dialogue, not debate. Tip number 3, find genuine common ground, especially common values as often as possible. I got to tell you about this thing. I just learned about this like a month ago, and I'm going crazy with all the different things I can learn from the study. There is a study that I just read about that was done at Stanford and Northwestern University on persuasion. They tested something that seems very intuitive, that if you ask someone to imagine and put themselves in their shoes from someone on the opposite side of an issue from them. So if you try to get a conservative to put themselves in the shoes of a leftist or vice versa and get them to imagine counter-arguments to their views, you would think that might result in them drifting toward the middle. It doesn't. It doesn't do that. It never works. Why? Because people are not good at that. People are not good at imagining smart arguments on the other side. So you'd ask a leftist who say, like, imagine a conservative who has a different view about immigration than you. Let's say a leftist who has maybe something like an open borders kind of an immigration policy versus a conservative who has a more strict immigration policy. Like, imagine why the conservative disagrees with you. Sometimes a leftist ends up with, well, maybe they don't like brown people. Like, that's not it for most people, okay? But they're just not good at getting into the other person's shoes. Neither side is good at that. But they tried something else. They said, imagine someone who is like you, who has the same values as you, is like you in every way, except they disagree with you about one issue, like immigration. So imagine a leftist who agrees with you about religion and agrees with you about government and all the other issues, but they happen to disagree with you about immigration. Why might they? Well, this is a tougher puzzle to solve. Because they can't just be like, well, racism, because they're not racist. That's part of the thing. It's like they can't just project that. It's like they've got to imagine someone like them. Gee, why would someone like me think differently? And then they start to figure it out. And then they drift toward the middle. Isn't that fascinating? There's so much we can learn from that. Like, I'm going to be thinking for years about this study. This is awesome. So here's what I've gotten so far. But it's only been like a month since someone sent me this thing. I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Here's what we learned, is the more that you can focus on common values, the more you will be persuasive to them. So the more that you can focus on the things that you have in common, not just issues, but the common values. Do you care about the same people? Do you feel similarly in some ways about God or government? And you won't have commonality on everything. But the more that you can put a spotlight on that, the more persuasive you're going to be. I have some views on political or moral issues that are very convenient for me to have on a college campus. I have some views that are very inconvenient for me to have on a college campus. So I focus on those convenient views. I want this person to understand we actually have some commonalities. I don't disagree with everything the GOP says. Okay? So here's some of my views, and I start becoming this multifaceted creature to them. I'm humanizing myself while I humanize them and try to humanize the unborn. And they're starting to get to know me more as a person. And I become more persuasive to them because I'm not as different from them as they expected when we first started talking. So the more that you can put a spotlight on the similar values that you have with them, the better off you're going to be. Tip number 4, don't think of the other person as your project or a potential notch for your belt. This is hard. Because this takes a lot of intentionality to do this. But that's objectifying the person and ignoring the principled reason for doing this. That it is just good in and of itself to love them. Tip number 5, don't just debate the issues. It is so good that in that Facebook group, we had this rule called Free Forum Friday. On Fridays, we were not allowed to talk about abortion. We had to talk about everything else. And people got personal. People were talking about their miscarriages. People were talking about domestic abuse situations. There was like a real level of kind of closeness and like the word that I want to use, but this word is misconstrued so often. But the word in my mind is intimacy. There was an intimacy there, the connection, but not in a romantic or sexual way. So don't just debate the issues. A lot of times when pro-life and pro-choice people talk, they think that they've just got to talk about this subject. Or I'm talking to someone who is gay. I got to make sure every time we talk that they know that I'm against same-sex marriage. Okay, they know. It's not a shock to them. Like it's okay. Like, you can talk about it sometimes. I'm not saying never talk about it, but it's totally fine to talk to a gay person for an entire conversation and not bring it up. Because that's more normal. That's how normal friends act. We don't constantly talk about all these different things. Tip number 6, understand their view well enough to show them why it's wrong in a way that they can hear and understand. Because that's what worked for Megan Phelps Roper. She needed to hear biblical arguments against what she was doing. And there were some people on Twitter, and I imagine some people who weren't Christians on Twitter who figured that out and showed her biblically why her behavior didn't make sense. And finally this, tip number 7, allow the person to remain unconvinced. People tend to change their minds very slowly. My best friend, Jonathan Fincher, said this thing I love. He said, people change their minds the way water slowly changes the contours of a rock. That's a lot more common than the person who just changes their mind in one day on a college campus. Like it happens. It happens about once in outreach for us, but that's not the typical situation. People change their minds really slowly. If you talk to a really smart atheist who gave you some evidence against God's existence, I do not believe that you'd be like, well, I guess that's it for me. I guess I'm an atheist now. I can walk away, like leave the church. Like I think it would take more than that, right? You would need more time to study what they had to say and study what smart Christians, have to say about that. And you'd think about hopefully smart arguments on both sides and then decide what makes most sense to you. But it wouldn't be this instantaneous change. But we expect that to happen for them. And then we're frustrated and we feel like failures when it doesn't. You will have a conversation about abortion with someone and they don't change their mind that day and we can feel like a failure. It can feel frustrating. I think sometimes that's spiritual warfare. I think spiritual warfare can be a lot about bullying and making us feel bad about things. That's something Pastor Ben told me. I think that's true. So, because most people are going to need months at least to change their mind about something important, we need to give them that time. And it's going to take multiple conversations. It might take years before they change their mind about this.